I was waiting at the temple. Prabhupada had arrived at the airport in his, I guess, limousine or car or whatever pulled up. And everyone was chanting. And I didn't know what to expect. I'd been chanting 16 rounds for about a week. And as soon as he got out of the car, I had a reaction that I'd never had before. I saw that it appeared that he was being projected from some other world. And I don't know how to put that into words to make the description match the actual experience, but it was though he, like in a theater when something's projected on the screen, and there's motion, but you know that it's coming from somewhere else. And that was his presence. It was unearthly. And immediately I could understand that this was my spiritual master, and this was an absolutely pure person. And I fell down on the ground and offered obeisances, although I'd never offered obeisances to anyone before. And just in my heart, I immediately accepted that this is who I've been looking for. So that was the first time. And then when he actually came into the temple, after he paid his obeisances to the deities, he walked down the center of the temple, and devotees on both sides, to the Vyasa-san, which is at the other end of the temple. And he was just glancing at everyone, just smiling, and just very, like, loving glances. But, you know, as everyone says, I think everyone I've ever heard talk about, when Prabhupada looks at them, you just felt that he understood everything about you, and you felt completely exposed as just a foolish, person. That it seems to be a kind of almost universal experience with devotees, that they have that feeling that you had no secrets. Prabhupada could understand everything about you, essential. So that was the first time. When our small temple in Florida was closed, we moved out to Dallas, and part of the reason I was brought out there was because I was one of the only people that had any credentials, teaching credentials. And so when Prabhupada came to Dallas quite a number of times, I'm not sure the exact, either 3 or 4 times, but he used to take walks on White Rock Lake, and which was the richer section. And a famous industrialist, H.L. Hunt, had a home there on White Rock Lake. So the devotees were telling Prabhupada that, Prabhupada, we tried to go see H.L. Hunt, but he wouldn't see us. Prabhupada said, oh, he would not see you? He said, but when death comes, will he also say, I cannot see you? He says, anyway, he may say, but death will come and do his business. And then he said, anyway, what would you tell him if you were able to see him, get in to see him? What would you have said? So then they were kind of on the spot. Well, somebody said, well, maybe we would show him your books. And he said, no. So we'd tell him about the school, and Prabhupada was, no. He didn't like those answers. And finally he said, you should tell him this. You should tell him he's become a wealthy man by stealing from the earth. He was an oil tycoon. He said, by stealing from the earth, he has become wealthy. He said, and at death, he will be punished very severely for this crime. He said, this is the way you should speak to him. So then, I don't remember which devotee, they said, Prabhupada, if we speak like this to him, he'll become angry. Prabhupada said, angry? He said, if I shake my stick at a dog, he will also become angry. He said, you have to learn how to talk to this class of men. And that was it. That was his instruction. On another occasion, on a morning walk at White Rock Lake, Prabhupada was just observing different things as he walked along. And then at one point, somebody pointed out there was a horse in a field on one of the estates running. And Prabhupada said, oh yes, horse. A horse is the most beautiful of animals. So then Satsvarup Maharaj, kind of almost like playing a straight man, said, Prabhupada, I thought a cow was the most beautiful. And Prabhupada thought that was really funny. He said, a cow? He said, a cow is not beautiful. And then Prabhupada said something to the effect that amongst the humans, amongst the women, the humans, he said, what did he say? The Jewish women are the most beautiful. Which I was kind of amazed by that. And then Satsvarup said, but Prabhupada, the black people say that they're the most beautiful. And Prabhupada said, everyone will say like that. That was it. It was just real light, but it was fun. Well, at one point, he used to have meetings with all the teachers because at that time he was trying to give us some idea how to organize a Gurukul institution. So he would discuss not just the Gurukul but other things. And at one point he was discussing the Mayavadis and Vedanta. And he said that Vedanta, he said these big Mayavadis, Ram, Krishna, Vivekananda, he said they also study Vedanta and others. He said, but they could not understand. And then he posed it to us why they cannot understand. And so, again, he liked to put us on the spot to see what we could come up with. So one of the devotees cited that verse, Nahang Prakasya Sarvasya Yogamaya Samanvit, which is actually a good answer, that because of the Yogamaya, because of the illusory potency, they're bewildered. But he wasn't satisfied with that answer, and various answers were given. And finally, Dayananda sat bolt upright and said, because they haven't got Bhakti Vedanta. And Prabhupada said, here is the answer. So all of us were feeling envious that Dayananda had been able to give such a great answer that Prabhupada was pleased by. On another occasion, I asked Prabhupada if I could bring a person who had been visiting us who had won the Teacher of the Year award in a nearby city. It was Fort Worth. I think he worked in Fort Worth. And he was a nice man. He and his wife had been coming pretty regularly to the temple, and I asked Prabhupada personally if I could bring them to see him. But when I went to bring them, and he gave me an appointment time, and then when I came back, on the way to his room, the teacher told me that he'd had a misfortune in his life, that he'd been driving a school bus and on Valentine's Day, and when the children got off at a certain stop, one of them, their card flew out of their hand. It went into the bus. He crawled into the bus, and he looked in both directions but didn't see anyone, and he ran over this child and killed them. So he was in distress, and he was thinking, how can I meet Prabhupada? I'm in such a state. I don't know if I can do this. And I said, well, just tell Prabhupada. And I wasn't sure that was the right thing, but anyway, as I immediately, when we got into the room, I told Prabhupada a little bit about the situation. And Prabhupada, I was just amazed by how compassionate. He asked him about a half a dozen questions, very particular questions. Did you look both ways? And he got a whole sense of what had happened. And after questioning him at some length to find out the whole story, exactly what happened, what had been the reaction of the parents, what had been the reaction of the school, then he said, you will not be, how did he put it? He said, you will not be troubled in this. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. And I don't remember the exact wording that he used, but basically he said, you will not be held to blame for this. So then this boy was completely pacified. And then he began to talk to Prabhupada and ask him different questions. And in the questions and answers, Prabhupada brought up this rocket scientist, Werner von Braun, that had gone before a scientific conference and declared that the real purpose of science was to establish the existence of God. And he'd said this to apparently a whole room full of scientists. And it caused consternation. But when Prabhupada read about it, he deputed some of his disciples to go and give him books and speak to him. So I got a little excited, and I said, oh, Prabhupada, this is so wonderful. I said, he's such a famous person. If he becomes interested in Krishna consciousness, this will be a great boon for the movement. And Prabhupada just looked at me and said, I'm not interested in speaking to him because he's a famous man. He said, that's not my interest. He said, but because he's come to the right point, therefore I'm interested in speaking to him. And we could see this, that throughout Prabhupada's preaching, if someone actually had some interest, whether they were low or high, big person or little person, he would spend sometimes hours with them just answering their questions and being merciful to them because of their sincere interest. One summer, Srila Prabhupada was visiting with us, and it was very hot. So he wanted to go outside, and at that time, there was no garden, a nice spot for him to sit. So he went out and sat on the lawn in a chair on Graham Street, which is the busy street. And all these cars were zipping by, and Prabhupada was sitting out in the lawn in a chair with just a sannyas, what do you call that? The top, whatever, the sannyasi top. Someone was fanning him with a peacock fan. We were sitting out around Prabhupada, and this man walked by on the sidewalk. And when he saw Prabhupada, he just did a double take, and it was more than he could handle, because just after he looked, and then he walked by, and he just couldn't handle it, so he walked back, and in a very demanding voice, he said to Prabhupada, "Why is that man fanning you?" And Prabhupada, was just sitting very relaxed in the chair, and he just said, "It is hot." So this man he didn't know what to say. He just turned on his heel and walked off. So Prabhupada kind of demolished his whole irritation with 2 words, or 3 words. "It is hot." And that was it. So that was kind of a humorous. On one occasion, at this particular time, this was 1976, I think. Harikesh, at that time the Gurukul was in a guest house room. We only had 4 or 5 kids. And Harikesh pulled me over to the side. He was at that time Prabhupada's secretary, and he said, "You're not running this Gurukula properly." He said, you should be like a guru figure to these children. You should be like the guru. You should not have such friendly, familiar relations. You should be like a guru." And I've never been all that submissive, so I said, maybe that's your opinion. I said, but as far as I know, Prabhupada never instructed us that way. And he'd instructed us a fair amount in Dallas, and I thought I had some idea what he expected. So I don't think that's. But anyway, he really getting on my case, and I kind of felt this, didn't know what to think. And then I went on upstairs, and a few minutes later, somebody came pounding up the stairs, knocking at the door. "Prabhupada wants to see you right away." And I'd never been summoned before, so I was kind of sort of a little bit shocked. And the only thing I could think to do is check to make sure I had tilak on, because I knew that you didn't want to go before the spiritual master without tilak. So I ran down the stairs, came into Prabhupada's rooms, offered my dandavats, and just as I got up, Prabhupada was sitting behind his desk looking really, really grave, like with the way his lips would turn down, kind of. He said, "So, you think you are guru?" I said, "What?" He said, "You think you are guru?" And I said, "Prabhupada, I never said that." And I was looking around the room desperately, and I saw Harikesh. I said, "He said that." So Prabhupada said, "What is this?" So then Harikesh was tempted to explain to Prabhupada, I guess, what his idea was. But after a couple of sentences, Prabhupada just waved him off. And then he looked back at me again. He said, "You are not guru." He said, "I am guru." I said, "I know." He went like this, like, "Be quiet." He said, "You are the experienced disciple. You are teaching the inexperienced, but you are not guru. Is it clear?" And I said, "Yes, Prabhupada." "All right," he said, "all right then." And then he sort of dismissed me. So I walked out of the room completely crushed, thinking, what have I done? I never thought that. Now I'm being chastised for it. And then years later, I kind of had the realization after we went through the period of difficulty, especially just after Prabhupada left, and where a lot of people were thinking that they were guru who maybe weren't so qualified, that I never had any illusions about what my situation was, at least, and that was kind of Prabhupada's mercy, that if I had any seeds of such desire, they were crushed from that one experience. So that made quite an impression on me. The devotees were talking to Prabhupada at the Kumbh Mela, and this devotee, Venkata Bhatta, told me this story, that this happened to him. And he was asking Prabhupada about bathing at all these auspicious moments. He says, "Is this something that, as Vaishnavas, that we should do?" And he said, Prabhupada said, "Vaishnava?" He said, "You are trying to become Vaishnava." He said, "Vaishnava is not an ordinary thing." So, in other words, that here we were just at the stage of what Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls, I think, Vaishnava Praya, which means a near Vaishnava. We're trying to approach the precincts of becoming a Vaishnava, but we're thinking, we're there, we're Vaishnavas. Is this auspicious stuff? Do we? And he also told me that Prabhupada more or less indicated that you're thinking this is not for you. He said, but you need all the help you can get. In so many words, you need all the help you can get. So bathing in an auspicious moment, go ahead. Well, Prabhupada used to sometimes come out and sit under the tamal tree in the courtyard, and he would sit under the tree and we would perform kirtan or bhajan. And it was kind of like an honor to be able to chant, just for Prabhupada's pleasure. So this one devotee, maybe I shouldn't mention names, but anyway, this one devotee who was very flamboyant, he used to have these dhotis and this very elaborate style with every mark of tilak was absolutely perfect, and he wore silk, and he was just like obviously very caught up, and he considered himself to be a very expert kirtaniya. And so he began to chant in this kind of very showy way. And Prabhupada listened to it for a few seconds, and then he just waved him off, and he pointed to one of the Gurukula boys. Now the boy that he pointed to could not sing. I mean, he had a voice like a strangled frog. I mean, it was the worst voice you could imagine. And he didn't have much of a clue how to play mridanga either. But Prabhupada asked him to chant. So this boy began wailing away on the mridanga, and as he was singing, his face went bright red, and you could see total sincerity in the effort, but the sound was atrocious. And Prabhupada was sitting there smiling and nodding his head and tapping his finger, and he was obviously enjoying it. And this other devotee got so upset, he actually got up and left. He couldn't handle it. But Prabhupada was appreciating that this boy is chanting completely from his heart, and this other chanting is kind of a show. So he didn't have much appreciation for show bottle. He was sitting behind a desk when he first came into the room. He was going to show us how to teach. So he came in, and when he first walked into the room, there was nothing for him to sit on. So he was just standing there. So somebody ran to the temple and got a large seat and put it down behind his desk. Prabhupada sat down. And then he said, so what are your questions? So then people began to ask questions, but some of the questions were coming from a position just to the side, almost behind Prabhupada. He said, no. You come to the front, then you ask. So he made them come from where they were sitting, got them to move, come up and sit in front of him to ask the question. Later on, I read in Manu that this is the etiquette, that when you sit before the spiritual master or the guru, you must sit never to the side or to the back of him, but always come and sit in the front and humbly put your questions. So this has been a long time ago, so I can't remember many of the specific questions, but I remember at one point he asked for some sticks, and he held up 2 sticks, and he said, all right, he said, this one is for the students if they misbehave. And he went like that, so people were stretching their hands out, and he said, and the other one is for the teachers if they misbehave. Of course, that instruction wasn't very well understood, unfortunately. Another time during this period, the Bagaji was Prabhupada's friend who was kind of helping with the management of Vrindavan. And he used to go in pretty regularly to see Prabhupada. Prabhupada liked to associate with him because one thing, Bagaji always told jokes. And of course, most of them were, I think, in Hindi. I didn't understand them, but they had quite a friendly relationship. And Bagaji was kind of like the patron of the Gurukula at that time. He had arranged for the land and so many things. So one day he was going in and I said, can I come with you? And I was thinking, well, I mean, I am kind of running this little fledgling Gurukula, and maybe I could go in too. Because, you were kind of afraid to even try to get in to see Prabhupada because, as someone was pointing out in some of the classes here, that it's like there was a wall of sannyasis and, older devotees that kind of were a little bit intimidating. So he said, yes, you come. So I went in, with Bagaji, and he went in to see Prabhupada, and they greeted each other, and Prabhupada had a couple of Indian guests sitting there with him out in the garden where they had the lotus fountain. And as soon as Prabhupada spotted me, he pointed to me and he said, go and get an asana. Or no, he didn't. He said, go and get some asanas. So I thought, oh my gosh. So I ran back out. I found Harisari. I said, Prabhupada wants some asanas. And Harisari, I don't think we have any. So then he began rummaging around in a closet, and he found this one kind of rumpled, not terrible looking, asana. He said, this is all I've got. So he gave it to me. So already I was in a sweat because I was, not getting anywhere. So I went back out with my asana, and Prabhupada spotted me again. I mean, as soon as I walked into that garden, immediately he said, get them some prasadam, because these guests were just getting up to leave. So, yes, Prabhupada. So I ran in, Prabhupada wants prasadam for these guests. He said, it's right over there on the table. So then they came out, I handed them the prasadam, and I did something right, And I went back out to the garden again, and I was just kind of standing there in the back with my one crumpled asana. And Prabhupada looked up at me again. As soon as I came in, he looked at me and said, so? He said, I've several times asked you to get some asanas. What is the difficulty? I said, Prabhupada, they only have this one asana. And he just looked at me kind of like. And then I, like an idiot, sometimes when you're destined to make an idiot of yourself, I said, Prabhupada, what should I do with this asana? He said, take your one asana and sit down. And then he began to laugh uproariously, and he and Bagaji were laughing. And he said something to the effect, I caught the drift of it. It was something to the effect of, these Westerners, what can you do? When they were laughing like uproariously, and I was the object of the laughter, but somehow I started laughing uproariously. Somehow it struck me as completely funny that I'd gone in there with aspirations to be recognized as one of the big devotees. And Prabhupada just crushed me completely and made me realize, I'm just, an insignificant servant, and I can hardly do anything right. It was just my whole ego was immediately reduced to its proper perspective. So it was quite an instructive experience as far as false ego goes. On another occasion, Prabhupada was circumambulating the temple, and there was a group of us. I can't remember whether it was at the beginning or the end of a walk. I think it was at the beginning of a walk, but he was circumambulating the temple. And at one point, when he came to the corner of the building, he stopped very suddenly, and the devotees almost ran into him. And he turned around, and he just said in a very grave voice, he said, "You are blind, but I can see." And so, we didn't know. Yeah, of course. We didn't know what to say. Nobody said anything. So then we went around again. And when we got back to the same spot, without saying anything, he just pointed to a light that was on. Now the sun had already come up, and the light was burning. Now his mood in Vrindavan was that none of pice should be wasted. So whenever any water was dripping, whenever there was any neglect, whenever there was any kind of merchant trying to get the better of us in some business deal, he was on top of it. And that was his comment. I am blind. You are blind, but I can see. So it kind of worked on every level. It was true in terms of the management of that temple. It was true in terms of our spiritual condition. It was a statement of truth, but it had a practical application. Another occasion, after a lecture, Gannagamian stood up, a friend of mine, and he asked Prabhupada, how can we ever repay our debt to you? And Prabhupada said, you can never repay your debt. He said, remain always indebted. So that was his response. And on another occasion, after he'd given a Bhagavad-gita lecture, this Indian man from the back of the temple room got up and said, I don't think he actually got up. He was just asking his question from the back of the room. And his question was something to the effect of, why was Krishna trying to tempt Arjuna to fight? Now, actually, this is, amongst many so-called religions, this is a very commonly asked question, apparently. because I've read since then that this is one of the challenges. Why was Krishna trying to agitate Arjuna into becoming violent? This seems to go against the principle of humility and peacefulness, etc., etc. So he was challenging, why was Krishna tempting Arjuna? And Prabhupada got kind of fiery and looked really irritated, and he said, "Come up here." Just like the way maybe like a grandfather would speak to his grandson who was really out of line. "Come up here," he said. And he motioned that this person should get up. And this person, as they came up towards the front to sit, just like kind of like in the classroom, to sit just in front of Prabhupada, he put him in the position of a student. And he said, "Now repeat your question." So by this time, the man was already quite diminished in his challenging attitude. And he kind of stammered it out again. And then Prabhupada began to roar at him. And he said, I can't remember, I wish I could remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of, "Do you think that Krishna, the Supreme Being who is all compassionate, would try to get Arjuna to do something that was against religious principles? When Krishna is Dharman tu sakshat Bhagavad-gita, Krishna is the origin of all religious principles, that he would advise Arjuna to do something against his own self-interest?" And he just was hammering this guy. And then when he got through, he just went like this. He just kind of discarded him, with a wave of his hand. And the man kind of almost crawled back to his original position. But apparently, that's what he thought that person needed at that instant. On one occasion, Prabhupada was asked, after he gave a lecture, I'm trying to remember the question. It went something to the effect of, what is it like to be always in touch with God? In other words, what is it like to be situated in God consciousness? So Prabhupada kind of pondered the question for a few seconds. And then he just answered, he said, "Without fear." And then he just smiled, like one of these gargantuan smiles. And without trying to hyperbolize the situation, I started grinning like an idiot, and I felt ecstasy. And the hairs on my arms were standing up on end, and I was feeling really emotional, and I thought, boy, I don't want to make an idiot out of myself, But I looked around the room, and everybody else was in the same kind of state. This sort of wave of ecstatic feeling went through the room. And for that moment, nobody had any fear. It was, I can't prove that, what's the word, scientifically, but it was like there was a moment where everybody had symptoms of ecstasy. And then later on I read in Chaitanya Shikshamrita that when someone's on the Uttama Adhikari platform, by their association, you can experience symptoms of bhava. Just briefly, by their grace, by their association. So that it was like a moment of ecstasy for everyone where they felt no fear. This was in Vrindavan. The Gurukul building was under construction. I probably would like to go over there every couple of days to see how it was progressing. So they went to the back of the building where all the workers were out there in the early morning, and he had a whole contingent of sannyasis and senior devotees with him. And they were looking out the back windows there at the workers, and they were out there, some of them were bathing under there was a pipe with water gushing out, and they were bathing, and some of them were on fires, were making chapatis, some of them were brushing their teeth with neem twigs, they were chanting. They were Brijbasis, a lot of them, so they were chanting songs about Krishna. And Prabhupada was just watching this whole scene and appreciating it. And finally he turned around and he said, "Just see." He said, "They will rise early in the morning. They will work all day long. For what?" He said, somebody said 3 rupees. For a few rupees, he said, they will work all day long in the hot sun. They will take bath. They will chant some mantra. He said, they will live in this simple way. He said, and then he was just kind of really appreciating how the simplicity of their life and how sincere and innocent they were. And then Hansaduta Maharaj said, "Prabhupada, we should learn to live like this." And Prabhupada just began to laugh, and he said, "You will never learn." You will never learn. Another time when he was circumambulating the temple, he came to originally they had used some kind of red stone that went around the parikram path, around the Krishna Balaram Mandir. And it was laid out in a particular pattern, but when it came to this one particular area where there was a curve, it was kind of a strange-looking arrangement of stone. And Prabhupada pointed to it with his cane and said, "What is this?" He said, "This is not a proper pattern." He said, "They have cheated you. They have given you the rejected stone. And they have charged you according to the rate for, the good stone. You've been cheated." Then Harikesh, well, this is the rasa that Harikesh had with Prabhupada. He would either try to correct or argue with Prabhupada. And everybody was always like kind of wondering, what's he going to say now? So he began to give an argument to Prabhupada. No, Prabhupada, actually it is a pattern. And he launched into a complex explanation of how it was actually a pattern. And so Prabhupada said, it's not a pattern. It's obvious it's not a pattern. And they were going back and forth. Finally, Prabhupada yelled at him. He said, "Yes," he said, "it is a pattern. It is a clown's pattern." And said, "And you are the fool." And then Harikesh began to laugh hysterically. And everybody was just kind of in awe that this person would have the nerve to argue with Prabhupada about something like this. But that seemed to be the nature of their relationship. But I just remember, yes, it is a pattern. It is a clown's pattern. Like Shayananda Maharaj was in the room with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was discussing various plans, preaching plans. And then he said, "So, what should we do?" And Akshayananda Maharaj replied, "Prabhupada, we'll just have to become Krishna conscious." And Prabhupada said, "Another impractical suggestion." That story kind of made the rounds in Vrindavan at the time, and I just always thought that was one of the most hilarious. Oh, and that these are just story. For instance, that story that the devotee was saying, "Oh, he was the most fallen." You know this one? "I'm the most fallen, Prabhupada." And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." That's it. I mean, this devotee was lamenting, like trying to show how humble he was, and he said, "Prabhupada, I'm the most fallen." And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." It's kind of like wanting credit for being the most something. And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." That always struck me. But that's what I mean. It was so quick, and it was so funny. It's so sharp and very sarcastic, but you never felt offended when he did it. Even if it was at your expense, it was funny. You had to admit it was really funny, and it always had an instructive edge to it. I think that was the other part that was so nice, that it was merciful. Because he was trying to help you. The false ego is such an obstacle, and he was trying to cut through that and make us try to get more in touch with reality. In Prabhupada's last days, we used to go in shifts. 24-hour kirtan was going on in his room, and we used to go in shifts. And I used to go in sometimes with a group of Gurukul students, and we would chant. I don't remember what our shift was. It was an hour or 2 hours. But we would chant using these very tiny cartels, making as little noise as possible because Prabhupada couldn't take too much sound, and they kept the lights quite low. And so Tamal Krishna Maharaj, as I remember, asked me to chant, to lead the chanting. So I began to chant, and I was thinking, I'd really like to please Prabhupada with this chanting. And so I tried to remember every tune that I'd ever heard him chant Hare Krishna mantra with. I didn't know that many, but I tried to make sure they were tunes that he chanted. So I was really concentrating, and I was chanting these different tunes. And then our shift was over, and we got up and went out. Well, the next day when we went to chant, Tamal Krishna Maharaj grabbed me by the arm and said, "You have to chant for Prabhupada." And I said, "Why? Sure, but..." He said, the other day when you were chanting, he said Prabhupada had called him over after we left and said, "Who was that chanting?" And Tamal, always like the guardian, said, "Was there anything wrong, Prabhupada?" And Prabhupada said, "No." He said, "It was nice. It was very nice," he said. So that was one. And then on another occasion, a Yodhapati, who is now P.B. Govinda Maharaj, I don't know his sannyas name. Anyway, his name at that time was a Yodhapati. And I were in Prabhupada's room, and they asked us if we would like to help massage Prabhupada. And so people were massaging somebody was massaging the head, some people were massaging the arms, legs, and Yodhapati and I each had one foot. And so we were massaging Prabhupada's feet. And I was feeling like I've always wanted to get the dust from Prabhupada's feet. And I never had the opportunity, and we were always worried about doing it anyway because, it was a little bit discouraged. And so we each had one foot. And I turned to Yodhapati, and I only know this because he told me. I hadn't remembered this till he told me. I turned to him and I said, "This is Vaikuntha." I said, and it was like, we just felt like we were in the spiritual world, with Prabhupada just massaging his feet and, just doing that as a service. It was real nice. And of course, I was also there when Prabhupada disappeared, left this world. And I'm sure you've probably heard plenty of stories from the devotees that were there. My own feeling at the time, it was just such a feeling of helplessness and desperation because, in fact, it was like that a lot during the last couple of months because it just felt like it was inevitable, but you couldn't stand the thought that he wasn't going to be with us. And on that last day, everyone was chanting. At first there was a kind of a back and forth, and then everybody began chanting together in the last moments. And again, it's not something you can empirically establish, but it felt like there were many more people in that room than were actually there. It felt like there was a heavenly chorus. It felt like there must be so many other personalities from other places who were present. And there was this tremendous feeling. I'm not trying to make light of it. It was like a Technicolor finish. Like when you have this spectacular ending to a movie or something. It was like this glorious chanting was going on, and Prabhupada was, with his last breath, was Hare Krishna, uttering the syllables Hare Krishna, and you could almost feel the ascent. It was like you sensed, okay, he's ascending now. He's with Krishna. And the emotions were so intense in the room, and some devotees became completely hysterical, crying. One devotee threw himself on the floor and just weeping. He couldn't control himself. Other people were completely stricken or stoic, or there were so many different kinds of reactions. But it was a very intense moment. But there was nothing inauspicious about it. It was completely auspicious. Sometimes they describe the sentiments of the gopis as being simultaneous nectar and poison. It was kind of like that. It was ecstatic because you knew that Prabhupada had perfectly executed the mission of human life and was back to Godhead. And but for us, it was loss, irretrievable and irreplaceable loss. So it was a very difficult period. Je anilo premadana koruna prachu